Today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating blueprint from the ancient book of Deuteronomy. Think of it as a guide for a society trying to solve a timeless problem. In a world just jam-packed with voices, who do you actually trust for spiritual truth? And, just as important, what kind of system do you build to support those leaders?
I mean, that's the core problem, isn't it? It was a massive challenge thousands of years ago, and it is absolutely still a challenge for us today. The text we're looking at, well, it provides a really structured and, frankly, very high-stakes answer to this exact question.
All right, so here's our roadmap for this journey. First, we'll look at how the spiritual leaders were even set up. Then, we'll see how the community actually supported them. After that, we'll get into the really hard lines they drew against outside influences. And finally, we'll get to the heart of it all. What was the sanctioned way to hear from the divine? And, this is the big one, what was the ultimate test for knowing if a message was actually true?
Okay, so first up, establishing the leadership. You see, if you want a group of people to dedicate their entire lives to spiritual matters, your whole society has to be structured in a very, very specific way. And for them, it all started with the Levitical priests.
And right here is the core of what made them so unique, this idea of an inheritance. See, while every other tribe in Israel got a piece of land to farm and build wealth on, the tribe of Levi, they were intentionally left out. Their provision, their entire livelihood, was meant to come directly from their spiritual role and the offerings of the people. The whole point of this setup was to keep them focused 100% on their duties. So, that naturally leads to the next piece of the puzzle. I mean, if the priests have no land, how do they actually live? How do they eat? The whole system falls apart unless the entire community is invested in supporting them. And this is where you see the really practical side of that support. It wasn't just some vague idea, hey, let's help out the priests. No, it was spelled out, codified. We're talking specific parts of sacrifices, the absolute first and best of the harvest. Even the first wool sheared from the sheep, all of it was designated for the priests. This created this direct, tangible link between what people did every single day in their spiritual leadership. This system also had this really important rule for fairness. Basically, any Levite, it didn't matter what town they were from, could come to the central sanctuary to serve. And if they did, they got the exact same share of support as the priests who were already there. It was a great way to ensure everyone had access and to stop some small elite group from hoarding all the resources.
Okay, so the internal system is all set up. Everyone knows their role. But what about all the external influences? This is where the text makes a hard pivot and draws a very, very clear line in the sand against the spiritual practices of all the surrounding cultures.
I mean, it doesn't get much more direct than this, does it? This isn't a friendly suggestion. It is a foundational command. The text is basically building a firewall, a clear cultural and spiritual boundary. It's defining the community just as much by what it is not as by what it is.
And wow, the text gets incredibly specific about what falls on the wrong side of that line. This list, it covers this huge range of occult practices that were pretty common back then. We're talking sorcery, casting spells, trying to contact the dead. All of these were labeled as basically forbidden paths to spiritual knowledge. So here's the really crucial part, the reason they give for all of this. The text argues that these practices aren't just wrong, they're spiritually corrosive to an entire society. It frames rejecting these methods as a matter of national survival, of identity. In fact, it claims this is the very reason the people who lived there before were losing their land in the first place.
All right, so if all those other ways of getting spiritual insight are off limits, what are people supposed to do? How are they supposed to get divine guidance? Well, that brings us to the official, sanctioned solution the text offers, the role of the prophet.
And the origin story for this whole prophet thing is actually rooted in pure fear. After this direct, totally overwhelming encounter with the divine at Mount Horeb, the people were just terrified. They basically said, we need a buffer. We need someone in between who can handle this level of intensity for us.
And this is the answer they got. The text says, God was like, okay, I agree to this arrangement. He promised to raise up a prophet, a human spokesperson. And this person wasn't supposed to be sharing their own brilliant ideas. Their job was to be a conduit, to speak the exact words put in their mouth.
But of course, this leads to the most important, most obvious question of all. If some guy stands up and says, hey everyone, I'm that prophet, and God gave me a message, how on earth do you know if they're telling the truth? This brings us to the ultimate test.
And what's so interesting is that the text totally anticipates this question. It knows there's a huge potential for fraud and for chaos. I mean, if you're going to base your entire society on the words of a prophet, you'd better have a foolproof way to know if they're legit.
And here it is, the test. It's shockingly simple and totally practical. It has nothing to do with how charismatic the speaker is or how much you like their message. The one and only test is this: does what they say is going to happen actually happen? If a prophet speaks and their prediction comes true, that message is from God. If it doesn't, they're a false prophet. End of story, full stop.
And believe me, the stakes could not have been higher. Speaking of false prophecy wasn't just a mistake, wasn't just an oops, it was a capital crime. This just shows you the immense weight and responsibility that came with this role. Getting it wrong, or just speaking out of turn, had the ultimate consequence.
So, to bring it all together, what we're looking at here is a really comprehensive system. First, it creates this dedicated spiritual class and a practical way for the whole community to support them. Second, it builds this strong firewall against any outside spiritual practices it considers dangerous. And most critically, it gives people a clear, results-based test for figuring out what's true.
And, that leaves us with a final thought. This ancient text laid out a very practical test for truth. Does it actually pan out in reality? So in our modern world, where we are just flooded with experts and influencers and endless sources of information all claiming to have the answers, it's a really powerful question to ask ourselves: what is our test for truth?